He saved 164 lives at 30,000 feet. Then the F-35 Escorts recognized his call sign. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. I can't believe it, the young airman muttered, still standing in the same spot by the hangar, watching as General Thompson and his entourage walked past him and the other pilots, heading toward the old man. The tension was thick in the air, and it felt like the entire base had stopped moving for a moment, holding its collective breath. The only sound was the rhythmic click of polished boots on the tarmac as the general approached the old man. The pilots, still in shock, exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. "Who is he?" one of the younger officers whispered to his partner. "Why is the general acting like that?" The officer looked down at the ground, clearly embarrassed for not recognizing the man standing before them. It wasn't long before the general stopped in front of the old man, his gaze intense, yet full of reverence. The moment was surreal. General Thompson, a towering figure with 4 stars on his uniform, had always commanded respect. Yet, in this moment, he was not just an officer. He was a man acknowledging something far greater than rank or protocol. The old man, standing with a quiet dignity, returned the general's gaze with a look that conveyed decades of experience, wisdom, and sacrifice. Without a word, General Thompson raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest salute. The 2 officers beside him followed suit instantly, their movements precise and unified. The young pilots, now witnessing this, stood frozen in awe, their previous arrogance replaced with respect and confusion. "Mr. Miller," General Thompson's voice boomed across the silent tarmac. "It is an honor to have you here." The old man, now revealed to be someone far beyond just an ordinary civilian, gave a slight nod. His weathered face softened with a knowing smile. "General Thompson," he said quietly, his voice low and gravelly. "It's good to see you again." The general dropped his salute, his stern expression turning into one of rare warmth. "I was hoping you'd come back," he said. The words hit the young pilots like a wave. The old man, who had seemed so unremarkable just moments ago, was now not just a part of history. He was the man who had shaped it. One of the younger pilots, still in disbelief, couldn't hold back. Your Dragon 6? The words slipped out before he could stop himself. The old man turned his head slowly, meeting the young pilot's gaze with a quiet intensity. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm Dragon 6. The silence that followed was deafening. The pilots stood rooted to the spot, their previous mockery now replaced by a profound sense of humility. The general turned toward the young pilot who had asked the question, his expression hardening. "You have no idea who you're standing in front of, do you?" The young pilot stammered, clearly realizing his mistake. I had no idea." The general nodded, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Mr. Miller here saved over 160 lives during a mission that no one thought possible. He did it at 30,000 feet, in the face of impossible odds, without the fancy technology you rely on today. His actions that day are legendary." The young pilot's mouth went dry as the words sank in. I had no idea," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The general's gaze softened, but his tone remained firm. "That's the problem with people today. They forget the ones who paved the way. They forget the sacrifices that were made. Mr. Miller didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do." The old man, Dragon 6, gave a slight smile, but it was tinged with sadness. "I didn't do it for glory," he said. "I did it for the men I lost and the men I saved. That's all that matters." The pilots stood in silence, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The general turned and looked back at his men, his expression resolute. "Remember this moment," he said, "and never forget the true meaning of service." With that, the general nodded at the old man and began to walk away, followed by his officers. The young pilots remained standing, still processing what they had just witnessed. They had come to the base that day expecting a routine mission. Instead, they had encountered a living legend. As the old man turned to leave, one of the pilots couldn't help but ask, "Sir, what should we call you?" The old man paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the tarmac ahead. "Call me Miller," he said with a quiet smile. "That's all I've ever been." The pilot stood still as the man walked away, his name now a symbol of bravery, sacrifice, and a reminder of what it truly means to serve. As they turned to walk back to their duties, they all carried with them the lesson they would never forget. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask for the recognition they deserve. The following day, the base was abuzz with rumors. The young pilots, still in shock from the encounter with Dragon 6, whispered to one another as they went about their duties. Each one of them had a different story to tell, but they all had one thing in common. They couldn't stop thinking about the old man, the hero who had walked among them unnoticed until that moment. As they gathered for their morning briefing, the air was thick with anticipation. The presence of General Thompson had been a rare event on the base, and no one could quite comprehend the full weight of what they had witnessed the day before. The quiet old man, Mr. Miller, had not only saved countless lives, but had done so in ways that modern technology couldn't even begin to replicate. The young pilots, usually so confident in their knowledge of warfare, now felt humbled. They were about to face a mission, but all they could think about was the legacy of the man who had walked among them just hours before. In the briefing room, Colonel Hayes, a seasoned officer with years of experience, addressed the gathered pilots. His usual authoritative tone was absent, replaced with a respect he rarely showed. "Listen up, men," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "Yesterday, we had a very special visitor. Mr. Miller, the man you all saw yesterday, is not just any retired soldier. He's a legend. He's the reason many of you are here today. And he's the reason that many of our greatest victories in the skies were possible." The room fell silent. Colonel Hayes took a moment to let the weight of his words sink in. Mr. Miller doesn't wear medals. He doesn't need to. He doesn't need recognition, either. His actions speak for themselves. Some of you were lucky enough to witness his service in real time, and for that, you should be thankful. The pilots looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of admiration and confusion. They were hearing things they never expected to hear from their commanding officer. "There's a reason the military calls men like him legends," Colonel Hayes continued. "He saved 164 lives in one mission, at 30,000 feet, without the advanced systems we rely on today. And he didn't do it for fame. He did it because that's what soldiers do." The room was still, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning in the background. The colonel's words had struck a chord. "You see," he said, his voice steady, "we can all be heroes, but it takes something more to be a legend. Mr. Miller's story is the kind of story that needs to be passed on, not for the glory, but for the reminder of what true service looks like." After the briefing, the pilots walked out of the room in a daze. Their minds raced with thoughts of what they had just learned. They had heard of legendary military figures, of course, but to see one in the flesh, one who had lived through it all and quietly stepped into the background, was something else entirely. The younger pilots couldn't shake the image of the old man's calm demeanor, the way he had just sat there, seemingly unimpressed by the pomp and circumstance around him. And yet, when he spoke, when he revealed his call sign, Dragon 6, it was as if the entire base had stopped in its tracks. They had been in the presence of greatness and didn't even know it. As the day wore on, the pilots went through their drills, but their minds kept returning to Mr. Miller. Some of them even caught themselves wondering if they could live up to the legacy of someone like him. Could they be the kind of leaders who acted without seeking glory, who stood silently in the face of adversity, and who put their comrades before themselves? It was a humbling thought. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the base settled into its usual routine, the old man, Dragon 6, was seen leaving the hangar. His back was straight, his steps measured, as though he had been doing this for a lifetime. He didn't look back, didn't seek recognition. He simply walked into the distance, a silent figure against the backdrop of the setting sun. The young pilots, who had once mocked him, now watched in awe. They understood now. They understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to live with honor. And as they watched Mr. Miller disappear into the horizon, they made a silent promise to themselves. They would not forget the lesson he had imparted, one that would carry them through their careers and beyond. The legend of Dragon 6 was no longer just a name on a call sign. It was a symbol of everything they strived to be. The days following Dragon 6 revelation passed by with a mix of curiosity and admiration. The pilots, now deeply aware of the legacy they had almost dismissed, couldn't help but reflect on the silent heroism they had witnessed. They had gone through the motions of their training, but now their minds were consumed with questions about the man who had come into their midst, revealed his name, and left them forever changed. Despite the awe and respect that Mr. Miller had earned, he remained a quiet figure on the base. He didn't boast about his past or his heroism. He simply continued to live his life with the same humility that had defined him for decades. To the young pilots, it was almost as if his legend was a quiet undercurrent to their daily lives. Always there, but never demanding attention. But this sense of reverence would soon be tested. A week later, the base was informed of a new mission. It wasn't just any mission. It was a high-risk operation that involved the covert retrieval of an asset deep in enemy territory. The mission was one of the most dangerous the pilots had ever been assigned. It would require precision, coordination, and a set of skills that many of them had never been pushed to. The tension was palpable as the briefing began. Colonel Hayes stood at the front, his expression grim as he outlined the details of the operation. "This is a Black Ops mission," he said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. "We'll be operating deep behind enemy lines, where the risk of detection is high. Every move will have to be executed flawlessly. No room for error. You'll be flying at high altitudes, under intense pressure, and the odds are stacked against us. But we're the best of the best, and we'll get the job done." As the briefing continued, the pilots prepared themselves mentally for the challenge ahead. The weight of their mission was clear, but they were used to high-stakes operations. They had the technology, the training, and the support. What they didn't realize, however, was that Mr. Miller, Dragon 6, had been following the operation's details from the sidelines. He had been quietly observing the young pilots, seeing the stress in their eyes, the hesitation in their movements. They didn't understand it yet, but the mission was testing them in ways they couldn't comprehend. Later that day, as the pilots prepared for the mission, a message was passed along from Colonel Hayes. "Mr. Miller will be joining you on this one," the message read. It was a shock. The pilots had no idea why an old retired hero would be joining them on such a critical mission. But there was no question when it came from their commanding officer. If Mr. Miller was coming, there had to be a reason. As the day of the mission approached, the tension among the pilots grew. They knew that their success or failure could have far-reaching consequences, and the pressure was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The skies would be their battleground, and they would need to rely on their training and instincts. As they climbed into their jets on the morning of the operation, the air was thick with anticipation. The engines roared to life, the adrenaline began to course through their veins, and the pilots took their places. But what none of them realized, as they ascended into the sky, was that Dragon 6, Mr. Miller, would play a pivotal role in their success. The mission took them over hostile territory, with the jets weaving between clouds and performing complex aerial maneuvers to avoid detection. As the operation progressed, one of the jets experienced a mechanical failure, throwing the entire mission into jeopardy. The young pilot, his hands sweating on the controls, tried to regain control of the aircraft, but nothing seemed to work. In that moment, he heard a voice on the radio, calm and measured. "This is Dragon 6. Hold steady. I'm coming in." It was the voice of the old man, now suddenly in control of a situation none of them could navigate alone. The pilots were stunned as Mr. Miller, in his own aircraft, swooped in and executed a flawless maneuver that brought the troubled jet back online. He didn't hesitate. He didn't panic. He just did what he had done countless times before: save the day. As they continued the mission, the pilots came to realize that Mr. Miller's skills were not just a relic of the past. They were a living, breathing example of what it meant to be a soldier, a hero, and a mentor. His calm under pressure, his precision, and his ability to read the situation made all the difference. By the time they completed the mission and returned to base, the young pilots were changed. They had faced the odds, relied on each other, and learned from the best. And as they debriefed the operation with Colonel Hayes, one of the pilots turned to Mr. Miller, who was standing silently in the corner. "Thank you, sir," the pilot said, his voice filled with gratitude. Mr. Miller just nodded, the quiet acknowledgement of his own actions speaking volumes. "It's what we do," he said softly. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the pilots to reflect on the lesson they had just learned. Greatness isn't always flashy. Sometimes it's quiet, humble, and ready to step in when it matters most. The days after the mission passed in a blur, but the feeling of victory was hard to shake. The pilots had accomplished what many thought impossible, and they had done it together. But for one man, the experience was nothing new. For Mr. Miller, Dragon 6, this was just another day in a long history of saving lives and executing the impossible. What struck the young pilots most, however, was not the success of the mission, but the way Mr. Miller had remained a quiet presence throughout it all. Even when the stakes were at their highest, when every decision counted, he had been calm. His demeanor remained steady and unshaken, and in his silence, he commanded respect. His actions spoke volumes. After the debriefing, Colonel Hayes called the pilots together for one last word. "Gentlemen, you've all done well, but I want you to remember something," he said, his voice steady and clear. "What you've learned from Dragon 6 goes beyond any checklist, beyond any protocol. His service, his life, is a testament to what true commitment looks like." The pilots stood in silence. They had heard about legends before, but now they had witnessed one firsthand. They had seen the kind of man who didn't need the spotlight, who didn't need accolades. They had seen a true hero. As the days passed, Mr. Miller faded into the background once more. He didn't ask for attention, didn't seek any kind of acknowledgement. He was a man of action, and his legacy lived on in the pilots he had mentored, in the mission they had completed together. But for the pilots, his presence lingered. They couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the man than anyone had let on. The truth was, no one really knew much about him. His history was a series of quiet moments, tucked away in the past. He wasn't one to share war stories or speak of his achievements. Yet, every time he stepped into a room, the air seemed to shift. He didn't need to announce himself. The pilots had been told enough. Dragon 6 was a legend, and that was enough. One evening, as the base settled into the quiet rhythm of the night, the young pilots gathered at the bar. They were talking about the mission, recounting the details, and wondering how things would have gone without Mr. Miller. They hadn't truly understood the weight of the situation until after the operation was complete. That night, one of the pilots, a young second lieutenant, finally spoke what they had all been thinking. "Do you think we'll ever really know what he did?" he asked, his voice soft. The other pilots exchanged glances. They knew what he meant. They had heard of the legendary actions, the heroic feats that had been attributed to Dragon 6. But there was always something more. Something that couldn't be fully explained. "We'll never know," the senior pilot replied, his voice thoughtful. "But what matters is that we saw what he did for us. We saw what he did for this country." They all nodded. There was a shared understanding now, a bond forged through experience. They hadn't just trained together, they had fought together, and in that battle, they had learned from the very best. The next morning, as the pilots prepared for their next set of training exercises, the base received a message that sent shockwaves through the entire facility. General Thompson had issued a directive. Mr. Miller was to be honored with a ceremony, a recognition long overdue. The pilots, still buzzing from their previous mission, couldn't believe it. For the first time, they would finally hear the full story of the man they had served alongside. The ceremony took place a few days later, on the tarmac where so many of their missions had started. The general arrived with his staff, and the base was packed with personnel, all eager to witness the recognition of a living legend. When Mr. Miller stepped forward, there was a hushed silence. The crowd, composed of soldiers, officers, and pilots, stood at attention. General Thompson took the podium, his voice filled with respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to honor a man whose name is synonymous with courage and sacrifice," the general began. "He has saved countless lives, completed missions deemed impossible, and has done so without ever asking for recognition." The general paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, before he turned back to Mr. Miller. "Dragon 6, you are the standard by which we measure ourselves. You've led by example, and you've shown us what true leadership looks like. For your extraordinary service, it is my honor to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross." The crowd erupted into applause, and Mr. Miller stood silently, his face betraying no emotion. It wasn't the medal that mattered to him. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a life well lived. As the applause continued, One of the young pilots who had been part of the mission stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude, "I just wanted to thank you. You saved us, and we'll never forget what you did for us." Mr. Miller looked at the young man, a faint smile crossing his lips. "You did it yourselves," he replied softly. "I was just there to make sure you got home." And with that, the ceremony concluded. But for the pilots, for everyone who had witnessed Dragon 6's humble service, the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The weeks following the ceremony were quiet, but for the young pilots, they were filled with reflection and growth. They had witnessed Dragon 6's humility, and now they were left with the task of honoring that legacy through their own actions. The memory of Mr. Miller, with his unwavering calm, stayed with them as they continued their training. They often found themselves questioning what they had previously thought was important, reevaluating the kind of soldiers they wanted to be. Was it enough to just fly the most advanced jets? Or did it take more to truly embody the spirit of service that Dragon 6 had shown them? They hadn't yet realized it, but these questions were shaping them into better pilots and better people. They found themselves more focused, more patient, and more aware of the sacrifices made by those who came before them. A few weeks later, a new operation came down the pipeline. It was classified, and the pilots were told that only the best would be chosen for this mission. The tension in the air was palpable. This mission wasn't just any mission. It was an operation that would test their skills to the limit. The pilots knew that if they succeeded, it would mark a significant milestone in their careers. But more than that, it would be their chance to prove that they could live up to the standard that Dragon 6 had set. The morning of the mission arrived. The pilots were briefed on the mission's objectives and the risks involved. It was a high-stakes operation, involving high-altitude reconnaissance followed by a precision strike deep into enemy territory. Everything had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes. As they prepared their jets and suited up, one of the younger pilots, still new to the unit, found himself looking around, searching for something, someone. He finally spotted him, Mr. Miller. The old man was standing off to the side, watching quietly. His presence wasn't commanding in the way a general's would be, but it was undeniable. There was a calmness about him that made the chaos of preparation seem trivial. The young pilot, feeling the weight of the mission on his shoulders, approached Mr. Miller. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful, "I just wanted to thank you again. You taught us what it means to serve, to do the right thing. When it matters. I don't know how you do it." Mr. Miller smiled faintly, his eyes thoughtful. "You'll learn," he said quietly. "It's not about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about doing it when no one else will." The young pilot nodded, taking in his words. "We're counting on you out there, sir," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Mr. Miller's smile faded a little, but his eyes remained steady. "I'm counting on you too," he replied. The young pilot turned and headed back to his squadron, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As the jets took off that morning, the sky was clear, but the weight of the mission was heavy. The pilots flew in tight formation, performing maneuvers that tested their precision and teamwork. Everything had to be perfect. There could be no hesitation. For the younger pilots, it was a chance to prove themselves. But for Mr. Miller, it was just another day, another mission where the stakes were high, but the outcome was never guaranteed. Hours passed as they executed their high-altitude reconnaissance. The operation was running smoothly, but the tension was mounting. As they neared the target zone, a complication arose. One of the jets experienced a system malfunction. It was the same young pilot who had spoken with Mr. Miller earlier. His instruments began to glitch, and the control panel flickered, sending a wave of panic through him. His heart raced as he fought to regain control. But then, through the static of the radio, a calm voice broke through. "This is Dragon 6. Stay calm, take a breath, and listen to your instruments." It was Mr. Miller's voice, steady and reassuring. The young pilot took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. He followed the instructions, recalibrating his instruments as Mr. Miller guided him through the process. "You've got this," Mr. Miller's voice continued. "Just like I taught you. You've got to trust your training, trust your instincts." The young pilot felt a rush of confidence wash over him. Slowly, he regained control of the aircraft. He had made it through, thanks to the steady presence of the old man. The operation continued without further issues, and the target was hit with precision. As they returned to base, the pilots were greeted with a mixture of relief and pride. They had completed The mission successfully, and it was a victory that would be remembered. But for the young pilot, the most important lesson wasn't the victory. It was the way they had approached it. They had done it with honor, with courage, and with the quiet strength that Mr. Miller had shown them. When they landed and disembarked from their jets, the young pilot looked over at Mr. Miller, who was standing at the edge of the tarmac, watching as always. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. "You did it," Mr. Miller said, his voice calm. "We did it," the young pilot replied, his eyes locked on the old man's. Mr. Miller smiled, a brief, knowing smile. "Remember, it's not about what you did today. It's about what you do tomorrow. Keep that in mind." The young pilot nodded, understanding that this was the true lesson Mr. Miller had been teaching all along. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about continuing to serve, no matter the circumstances, and doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. The days after the mission were quieter, but the weight of what they had accomplished was not lost on the pilots. Their training had been pushed to its limits, but they had emerged victorious. The success of the mission was a testament to their hard work and skill, but more than that, it was a reminder of the quiet strength that Dragon 6 had shown them. Mr. Miller's words, his lessons, had settled into their minds, guiding them even after the mission was complete. They had learned to trust not just their training, but their instincts and the calm confidence that Mr. Miller had always exuded. The pilots carried those lessons with them as they returned to their regular routines. But even though they were back to their usual training, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They had a deeper respect for the work they did, and for the men who came before them. They were no longer just chasing success. They were chasing a standard that went beyond medals and accolades. They had learned that true heroism was quiet, that it was about doing the right thing even when no one was watching. They had learned from Dragon 6. Weeks passed, and the base continued to hum with its usual activity. The young pilots had resumed their training, but they could feel something had changed. There was a certain reverence in the air now, a recognition that they were part of something much larger than themselves. It wasn't just about flying jets anymore. It was about honoring the legacy of those who had served before them. But one morning, something unexpected happened. The base received an urgent call. The country was facing a new threat, one that required immediate action. The pilots were called into action once again, and this time, the stakes were even higher. The mission was critical. It would involve high-altitude combat and a precision strike deep into enemy territory, much like the previous mission, but this time, the threat was far more dangerous. The pilots knew the risks. They knew the consequences, but they also knew they had been trained for this, and they knew that Dragon 6 lessons would guide them through it. As the pilots assembled for their briefing, the air was thick with tension. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room, his expression grim. He outlined the details of the mission, explaining the risks and the importance of the operation. It was a high-stakes mission, one that would require the pilots to operate at their best, with no margin for error. After the briefing, the pilots returned to their planes, their minds focused. The weight of the mission was heavy, but they had learned how to handle pressure. As they suited up and climbed into their jets, there was a quiet confidence in the air. They weren't just ready, they were determined to succeed. The mission unfolded quickly. The pilots flew their jets at high altitude, weaving through clouds, carefully coordinating their movements to avoid detection. As they neared the target, they faced unexpected resistance. Enemy forces were more entrenched than expected, and the mission became more dangerous by the second. The pilots fought their way through the resistance, executing maneuvers with precision. But just as they were nearing the target, one of the jets experienced a malfunction. It was one of the newer pilots, a young lieutenant who had just completed his first few missions. His heart raced as his instruments began to fail. The screen flickered, the controls became unresponsive, and panic set in. In that moment, the young pilot remembered the calm voice of Mr. Miller, Dragon 6. He took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. He had learned from the best. He reached for his backup controls, doing everything he had been taught to do in moments like this. His hands moved with practiced ease, and slowly, the jet came back under control. But it wasn't just the technical skills he had learned that guided him. It was the calm, unwavering confidence that Mr. Miller had instilled in him. As the young pilot regained control, he heard a voice crackle over the radio. "This is Dragon 6. You've got this. Stay calm. Trust your training." It was Mr. Miller's voice, steady and reassuring. The young pilot felt a surge of confidence wash over him. "Thank you, sir," he muttered, barely able to contain the relief. With the jet back in the fight, the mission continued. The pilots executed their maneuvers flawlessly, completing the operation with precision. As they returned to base, the young lieutenant reflected on the mission. He had faced his first true test under pressure, and he had passed it. Not because of his equipment, but because of the training he had received and the lessons from Dragon 6 that had carried him through. When they landed and disembarked, Colonel Hayes was waiting for them. He gave them a brief nod, his usual stoic demeanor softening. "Good work, all of you," he said. "You did it." The young lieutenant stood a little taller, knowing that this victory was not just his, but the result of everything they had learned from Mr. Miller. They weren't just pilots, they were part of a legacy of quiet heroism, unwavering resolve, and selfless service. And that was something they would carry with them, no matter where their missions took them next. It had been a month since the high-stakes mission, and the pilots had settled back into the routine of their training. The adrenaline from the mission had worn off, but the lessons learned, especially from Dragon 6, continued to resonate deeply within them. There was a new sense of purpose in the air as they gathered for a debriefing after another successful drill. Colonel Hayes stood before them, a rare smile on his face. "Well done, all of you," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You've all grown tremendously since your last operation. Your teamwork, your focus, it's exactly what we need when things get tough. But there's something else you need to understand. It's not just the mission that matters. It's how you handle the pressure and uncertainty along the way." The pilots nodded, understanding that the colonel wasn't just talking about technical skill, but the kind of quiet resilience they had seen in Dragon 6. They had learned, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to be a soldier. They weren't just flying machines. They were part of a much larger picture, one that required sacrifice, precision, and integrity. After the debriefing, the pilots filed out of the room, the air buzzing with conversation about the mission, the lessons they had learned, and the path ahead. As they walked toward the hangar, one of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Carter, found himself walking beside Mr. Miller. "Sir," Carter said, hesitating for a moment, unsure of how to phrase his thoughts. "You've taught us so much, more than we could ever imagine. But there's something I still don't understand. How do you keep going, day after day, without ever asking for recognition?" Mr. Miller turned to him, his face calm as always. "It's not about recognition," he said simply. "It's about knowing that what you're doing is bigger than you. It's about the men and women who need you, even when they don't know it. And sometimes, it's the quiet moments when you realize you've done your job that matter the most." Carter was silent for a moment, reflecting on those words. The old man's wisdom was simple but profound. He had never sought the spotlight, yet it seemed to follow him everywhere he went. "Do you ever wish things were different?" Carter asked, genuinely curious. Mr. Miller shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "The path I've taken wasn't easy, but it's mine. And if it's made a difference to anyone, then that's enough for me." They continued walking in silence, Carter lost in thought. The old man had lived a lifetime of service, yet he never spoke about the countless lives he had touched. He didn't need to. His legacy was clear in the way the pilots now looked at him, in the respect they had for his actions and the lessons he had imparted. Later that week, the base received word that a new mission had been assigned to their unit. This time, however, it wasn't just about reconnaissance or precision strikes. The mission involved a covert operation deep within enemy lines, and the stakes were higher than ever. The pilots were called into action once again, and this time, they knew they would have to rely not only on their training, but on the quiet strength that Mr. Miller had shown them. The day before the mission, Colonel Hayes addressed the pilots in the briefing room. "This is a critical operation," he said, his voice somber. "We will be flying into territory that is heavily guarded. We've been given a narrow window to complete the task, and every second will count. Trust your training, trust each other, and above all, remember what you're fighting for. You represent the best of us, and you have the responsibility to carry that legacy forward." As the pilots prepared for the mission, the air was thick with tension. They knew the risks, but they also knew they had the skills to succeed. Yet, despite the advanced technology at their disposal, they couldn't shake the feeling that they needed something more. They needed that quiet confidence, the same kind of resolve that Mr. Miller had shown them. As the jets roared to life the next morning and the pilots soared into the sky, Carter found himself thinking back to the words Mr. Miller had shared with him. "It's about knowing you've done your job," he whispered to himself. The operation began smoothly, but as they approached the target area, things took an unexpected turn. A sudden burst of enemy fire threw their formation into disarray, and one of the jets took a hit. The pilot, a young airman, struggled to keep control as the aircraft began to spin out of control. Carter's heart raced as he watched, knowing that one mistake could result in disaster. But then, just as he thought things were lost, a calm voice crackled over the radio. "This is Dragon 6. Stay with me. We've trained for this." It was Mr. Miller's voice, steady as ever. Carter's grip tightened on the controls. He had heard the stories, but now, he was experiencing what it meant to have Dragon 6 watching over him. The young airman managed to regain control of the jet, and with Mr. Miller's guidance, they continued the mission. The operation was successful, and as they returned to base, the pilots were met with cheers and applause. But for Carter, the victory was not just about completing the mission. It was about the way they had done it. It was about the calm, the confidence, and the knowledge that they had made it through because they trusted in each other and in the lessons they had learned from Mr. Miller. As they landed, Carter looked up to the skies, silently thanking the old man who had taught him so much. He had become not just a mentor, but a symbol of everything they strive to be: selfless, humble, and willing to sacrifice everything for those who depended on him. The legacy of Dragon 6 had been passed on, and it would never be forgotten. The weeks following the mission brought an unexpected calm to the base. The pilots had completed their most challenging operation to date, and the weight of the success was settling in. They were different now, not just in their skills, but in the way they carried themselves. They had been tested in ways they hadn't anticipated, and they had learned from it. But even as they returned to their routine, there was a growing feeling that something big was coming. Colonel Hayes had called them in for a briefing late one afternoon, the air in the room thick with anticipation. As they entered the briefing room, they could feel the change in the atmosphere. The colonel stood at the front of the room, his expression more serious than usual. "Gentlemen," he began, "we've been given a new directive. A high-level operation. It will require all of you, and it will test you in ways that we haven't faced before. But I know you're ready. You've proven that to me time and time again." The pilots exchanged glances, their confidence buoyed by the colonel's words. But there was a lingering uncertainty. What could be more challenging than the mission they had just completed? "This operation," the colonel continued, "will take us into unknown territory. We don't know exactly what we'll face, but we do know one thing. The outcome depends on our ability to adapt quickly and decisively. There will be no room for error." As the colonel laid out the mission's details, the pilots listened intently. It was a mission that would require them to operate at extreme altitudes, deep inside enemy airspace, and perform a strike on a heavily fortified target. The odds of success were slim, but the colonel had faith in his team. "We're not just doing this for the mission," he said, his gaze sweeping over the pilots. "We're doing this for the people who depend on us. This is our time to show what we're made of." After the briefing, the pilots went back to their quarters to prepare. The mood was tense but focused. They knew what was at stake. And in the back of their minds, the words of Dragon 6, Mr. Miller, echoed. "Trust your training. Trust your instincts." It was the advice that had guided them through the toughest moments, and now, more than ever, they needed it. As the day of the mission arrived, the pilots suited up and climbed into their jets. The roar of the engines was a familiar sound, but today it carried a sense of finality. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. The mission began smoothly enough, with the pilots working in sync, navigating through the skies with the precision they had been trained to execute. But as they neared the target zone, the operation took an unexpected turn. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky as they entered enemy territory. The jets weaved in and out of the barrage, each pilot pushing their aircraft to the limit. The young pilot who had been in Mr. Miller's squadron, now a seasoned officer, felt his heart racing as the explosions rocked the sky around them. He had faced danger before, but never like this. It was different this time, more real, more personal. He glanced over at his wingman, who was signaling for backup. Without hesitation, he hit the radio. "We've got your back, stay on course," he said, his voice steady. As they advanced, the resistance grew fiercer. Enemy jets appeared on their radar, and the dogfight that ensued was like something out of a nightmare. But even as chaos unfolded around them, the pilots remained focused. They fought back with everything they had, relying on their training, their instincts, and their knowledge of each other. As they neared the target, the young officer felt a familiar presence in his mind. It was as if Dragon 6 himself was there with them, guiding them through the storm. The calm, steady voice he had heard in his head countless times before now seemed to be speaking louder than ever. Stay calm. Focus. You know what to do. The words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of panic. He steadied his hands on the controls and executed the maneuver, locking in on the target. A moment later, the missile flew from his jet, cutting through the sky with deadly precision. The explosion was deafening, the target obliterated in an instant. The mission was complete. As they made their way back to base, the pilots were exhausted, but the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. They had done it. Against all odds, they had succeeded. As they landed, Colonel Hayes was waiting for them on the tarmac. His expression was as stoic as ever, but his pride in his pilots was evident. You did it, he said, his voice steady. You took on the impossible, and you came through. You've earned your place among the best. The young officer looked around at his fellow pilots, knowing that they had all grown from this experience. And as he glanced toward the horizon, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward the man who had helped guide them to this moment. Dragon 6, Mr. Miller, had given them the tools they needed to succeed, and they had carried his legacy with them into the skies. In that moment, they realized something. They were no longer just students learning from the past. They were the ones now shaping the future, passing on the lessons they had learned from Dragon 6 to those who would follow in their footsteps. The weeks following their success were filled with both reflection and anticipation. The young pilots had gained confidence, but they also felt the weight of responsibility settle upon their shoulders. They were no longer just rookies learning the ropes. They were seasoned airmen, molded by the challenges they had faced, and more importantly, by the legacy of Dragon 6. They knew that what they had learned from Mr. Miller was something that could never be taught in any manual or through any simulator. It was the kind of wisdom that could only come from years of experience, of living through the unimaginable and emerging stronger on the other side. The base had returned to its usual rhythm, but the pilots felt a deeper connection to each other. They weren't just teammates anymore. They were brothers and sisters who had been through the fire together and had come out victorious. Their shared experiences were the foundation of their new understanding of what it meant to serve. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling training exercise, Colonel Hayes called for a debrief. As they gathered in the briefing room, there was an unspoken tension in the air. The colonel's usual demeanor was different today, more serious, more intense. He had something important to say. I have just received a report, he began, his voice commanding attention. There's been a situation, and it's bigger than anything we've dealt with before. A threat to national security. The kind of mission that requires everything we've got, and then some. The pilots exchanged looks, sensing the gravity of the situation. We'll be heading out in 24 hours, the colonel continued. This is not going to be easy. We'll be flying deep into enemy territory, conducting a high-stakes operation that involves precision strikes, intelligence gathering, and stealth maneuvers. It's the kind of mission where failure isn't an option. The room fell silent. The pilots knew what that meant. If they were going to succeed, it wouldn't be just about their skills as airmen. It would be about their ability to work as a unit, to trust each other under the most intense pressure. And above all, it would be about the quiet confidence they had learned from Mr. Miller. As they prepared for the mission, the weight of the task ahead settled in. But there was no fear. They had come a long way since their first mission. They knew what they were capable of, and they knew that the strength they had gained was not just in their aircraft or their weapons. It was in the trust they had built within their team, the lessons they had learned from their experiences, and the wisdom of the man who had taught them the true meaning of service. The next day, as they climbed into their jets, the young pilot who had once struggled in the heat of battle found himself once again thinking about Dragon 6. Stay calm. Focus. You know what to do, Mr. Miller's voice echoed in his mind. The sky was clear, the winds calm, but the air was heavy with anticipation. The pilots took off in formation, flying high above the clouds as they made their way to the target zone. The mission was underway, and every decision, every maneuver, had to be precise. As they neared the enemy's airspace, the tension escalated. They had to be invisible, no mistakes. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. The radar systems were already detecting enemy aircraft, and the pilots had to navigate through a minefield of threats, both in the air and on the ground. But despite the danger, the young pilots felt the same calm they had during previous missions. They weren't alone. They had each other, and they had the lessons they had learned from Mr. Miller. As the mission progressed, the situation grew more complicated. The enemy forces were stronger than anticipated, and they found themselves engaged in a fierce dogfight with enemy jets. The young pilots fought back with everything they had, but the odds were not in their favor. In the midst of the chaos, one of the jets took a direct hit. The pilot's control systems went offline, and the aircraft began spiraling toward the ground. The young lieutenant, the same one who had been saved by Mr. Miller's guidance before, watched in horror as his wingman's jet tumbled through the air. Without thinking, he immediately contacted the downed pilot. "I'm coming for you," he said into the radio, his voice steady despite the panic rising within him. He pulled his jet into a sharp turn, pushing the aircraft to its limits as he raced toward his wingman. As he closed the distance, he could see the other pilot, struggling to regain control of his jet. But the damage was too severe, and the aircraft was heading straight for the ground. Without hesitation, the young lieutenant made a split-second decision. He lowered his altitude, flying just below his wingman, and pulled his jet into a hard bank, using his position to shield his wingman from further enemy fire. "Trust me," he muttered under his breath, remembering the words Mr. Miller had once said to him. The enemy jets locked onto his aircraft, but the young lieutenant didn't flinch. With one last desperate push, he performed a high-speed roll, evading the incoming fire, and allowing his wingman to eject safely. As the lieutenant pulled up into the sky, his heart was racing. His mind was flooded with a mix of relief and adrenaline. He had done it. They had done it. They had saved each other, just like they had promised. As they regrouped and completed the mission, the pilots returned to base, exhausted but victorious. The operation had been a success. They had completed their objective, and they had done it together. And as they debriefed with Colonel Hayes, the young lieutenant felt a sense of pride that went beyond any medal or award. It was the pride of knowing that they had become the kind of team Mr. Miller had always believed in. They had trusted each other, and in doing so, they had honored his legacy. The weeks following their successful mission felt like a turning point for the pilots. They had just completed their most challenging operation yet, and the lessons they had learned, both from each other and from Dragon 6, had truly shaped them. They were no longer just a group of individual pilots. They had become a team, united by the shared experiences that had tested their limits. They had each earned their place, not just through skill, but through their resilience, their ability to work together, and, most importantly, their unwavering trust in one another. It was a trust that Dragon 6 had modeled for them, the quiet man who had never asked for recognition, but whose influence was undeniable. As they continued their training, they carried the lessons of their previous mission with them. They were stronger, more focused, and more aware of the responsibility they now had, not only to their country, but to the legacy of service they represented. But even as they found their rhythm, they knew that another challenge was just around the corner. And sure enough, one day, as they were gathered for a routine briefing, Colonel Hayes entered the room with a look on his face that told them this would be no ordinary assignment. "This isn't just another operation," he began, his voice steady but filled with authority. "We've been tasked with a mission that's far more complicated than anything we've faced so far. The stakes are high, and the risks are even higher. But I'm confident in this team. You've proven time and time again that you can handle whatever comes your way." The pilots exchanged looks, their minds already racing with the possibilities. They had learned to expect the unexpected, and they had learned to trust in the training and camaraderie that had been instilled in them. "This mission will take us deep into hostile airspace," Colonel Hayes continued. "We're going to be flying at extreme altitudes, facing more than just enemy aircraft. This will be a test of everything you've learned. It will push you to your limits. But I have no doubt you'll succeed, as long as you keep your focus, your composure, and work together. Remember, this mission isn't about individual glory. It's about making sure we all make it back safely." As the briefing continued, the weight of the mission began to sink in. The pilots knew the risks. They had been through difficult operations before, but this was different. This time, they weren't just going to be facing enemy fire. They were going to have to fight against the elements, against impossible odds. It was going to take everything they had learned, and more. After the briefing, as they made their way to the hangar, one of the young pilots, Lieutenant Carter, found himself once again walking beside Mr. Miller. He had come to admire the old man more than he had ever thought possible. Mr. Miller had shown them that true strength wasn't about the loudest voice or the fastest jet. It was about resilience, humility, and an unshakable commitment to those around you. "Sir," Carter said, breaking the silence, "do you ever get used to this? The pressure? The danger?" Mr. Miller glanced over at him, his expression as calm as ever. "You don't get used to it," he said quietly, "but you learn to manage it. You trust in your training and in your team. And you remember why you're doing it. It's not for the glory or the recognition. It's for the ones you're flying with, and for those who depend on you." Carter nodded, absorbing the weight of the words. It was a lesson he had learned many times, but it always seemed to carry more meaning when Mr. Miller spoke it. The next day, as the pilots climbed into their jets, there was a sense of quiet determination in the air. They had faced challenges before, but this was the mission that would define them. As the jets roared to life and ascended into the sky, the pilots flew in formation, moving as one cohesive unit. The sky was clear, but they knew better than to let their guard down. The mission was far from routine, and they would need every ounce of focus to succeed. As they neared the enemy airspace, the tension increased. The radar systems began picking up enemy planes, and the pilots braced themselves for what was to come. As the first shots rang out, the air was filled with the sounds of battle. Jets flew past them at lightning speed, enemy aircraft diving toward their formation. The pilots moved with precision, evading enemy fire and striking back with calculated force. But just as they were nearing the target, disaster struck. One of the jets was hit, and the pilot was forced to eject. The young lieutenant, who had been with the team since their first mission, felt a surge of adrenaline as he watched his wingman's aircraft spiral toward the ground. Without thinking, he immediately radioed his squadron. "I've got him," he said, determination in his voice. "I'll bring him back." As he flew toward the area where his wingman had ejected, the young lieutenant's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the risks. He knew the danger. But he also knew that they couldn't leave anyone behind. With his heart in his throat, he pulled his jet into a tight loop, dodging enemy fire as he descended toward the parachuting pilot. Just as he reached the ground, he saw his wingman. The young lieutenant swooped in, quickly lowering his altitude to pick him up. It was a risky move, but he had no other choice. As he pulled up and soared back into the sky, his wingman safely aboard, the young lieutenant's heart began to slow. The mission wasn't over yet, but they had made it through together. They had trusted each other, just as Mr. Miller had always taught them. And they would finish the mission as a team, just as they always had. The aftermath of the mission left the pilots feeling a sense of pride that was hard to describe. They had pulled off one of the most dangerous operations of their careers, not just by relying on their skills, but by trusting each other in ways they hadn't thought possible. They had learned the true meaning of teamwork and, most importantly, the value of leadership through service. The young lieutenant, who had been at the center of the rescue operation, couldn't stop thinking about the moments that had led to their success. He had been in the thick of it all, dodging enemy fire, saving his wingman, and guiding the squadron to victory, but it was the lessons of Dragon 6 that had made it all possible. When the adrenaline had worn off and the mission was over, it wasn't the flight maneuvers or the technical precision that stayed with him. It was the calm, steady presence of Mr. Miller. He had been there throughout the entire mission, not physically, but in the minds of every pilot. His teachings had stayed with them, guiding them through their decisions and actions. The night after the mission, as the pilots gathered for a debrief, they found themselves talking not about the operation itself, but about what it had meant. They spoke about Dragon 6 and how, even though he wasn't physically there, his influence had been felt every step of the way. "I don't know about you guys," Lieutenant Carter said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction, "but I feel like Mr. Miller is always watching over us. It's like he's been part of every decision we made." The other pilots nodded, agreeing silently. They all felt it, the weight of his legacy, the silent strength he had passed on to them. It wasn't just the technical stuff he taught us, Carter continued. It was the way he carried himself, the way he handled pressure. It's like he's always in control, no matter what. Even when everything's falling apart, he stays calm. He's not leading with his hands or his words. He leads with his actions. And that's what got us through today. The room was silent for a moment as they all reflected on his words. It wasn't about the flash or the grandeur. It was about quiet leadership, the kind that inspired confidence without ever needing to say a word. Colonel Hayes, who had been listening from the front of the room, spoke up. That's exactly right, he said, his voice filled with pride. Mr. Miller has never needed to boast. He doesn't care about recognition. All he cares about is doing the right thing. And that's why he's been able to accomplish so much. Not for glory, but for the greater good. You've all learned that, whether you realize it or not. He paused, looking at each of the pilots in turn. And now, you've all become part of that legacy. The pilots sat back, the weight of those words sinking in. They had become more than just soldiers. They had become leaders in their own right, carrying forward the values that Dragon 6 had passed on to them. As the debriefing ended, they filed out of the room, each of them lost in thought. The mission had been completed, but they knew that the real work had just begun. They had learned how to trust each other, how to lead with quiet strength, and how to handle the pressure of the most intense situations. But there was more to it than that. They had learned to be part of something bigger than themselves. And it was that realization that would carry them through whatever came next. The next morning, as they prepared for another round of training exercises, they were approached by Mr. Miller himself. He had been on the base, keeping to himself as always, but this time, he had come to speak with the pilots directly. I heard you did well, he said, his voice as steady and calm as ever. The pilots turned to him, humbled by his presence. Thank you, sir, Lieutenant Carter said, stepping forward. We couldn't have done it without everything you taught us. Mr. Miller nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the group. You didn't need me, he said softly. You just needed to trust each other. That's the key. You're all capable. You've got everything you need. Just remember, it's not about being the fastest, the strongest, or the best. It's about knowing your role and executing it when it matters most. The pilots nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. They knew that they weren't done learning from Dragon 6. They had only just begun to understand what it meant to be truly great, not just as pilots, but as people. As Mr. Miller turned and walked away, the pilots watched him go. They knew that his quiet example had shaped them in ways they couldn't yet fully grasp. But they also knew that the lessons he had given them would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And that was something they would carry with them, no matter where their missions took them. They had learned what it truly meant to serve, to lead, and to honor the legacy of those who came before them. And as they took to the skies once more, they did so not just as soldiers, but as leaders, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of base life slowly returned to normal. But the legacy of what the pilots had learned from Mr. Miller, Dragon 6, was now embedded deeply within them. Every mission, every training session, every interaction with one another was a reflection of the lessons he had imparted. They no longer just followed orders. They led with integrity, humility, and a quiet strength that was as powerful as it was unassuming. The missions had become more routine, but the challenges they faced were never easy. The pilots had learned how to manage adversity, how to push through when the odds were against them, and how to trust in each other when everything else seemed uncertain. They were no longer just a group of individuals. They were a team, bonded by shared experiences, mutual respect, and a commitment to something greater than themselves. One crisp morning, Colonel Hayes called them into a briefing. There was a new mission on the horizon, one that would take them to a place unlike any they had been before. The details were classified, but the sense of importance was palpable. This is a special assignment, Colonel Hayes began. You've been chosen for this because of what you've accomplished and because of who you've become. I trust you all to carry out this mission with the same resolve, the same leadership that Mr. Miller instilled in you. Remember, it's not just about the mission. It's about who we are as a team. You've learned to trust each other, and that's what will carry you through. I expect nothing less than perfection. The pilots stood tall, ready to accept the challenge ahead. Their minds were focused, but in the back of their thoughts, they could not help but remember the calm presence of Mr. Miller. His lessons echoed in their hearts and minds. As they prepared for their mission, there was no fear. There was only purpose. They were more than capable. They had been trained for this. But even more than that, they had learned from the best. They had learned from Dragon 6. The mission itself was demanding. It involved stealth, precision, and quick decision-making. The pilots would need to work in complete unison, just as they had done in their previous operations. There were no room for mistakes. The stakes were high. As they flew deep into enemy airspace, the tension among the pilots was palpable, but they kept their composure. They communicated silently, knowing what the others needed without even having to speak. They had become like a well-oiled machine, each pilot performing their roles seamlessly, anticipating each other's moves. It was clear to everyone that this was no longer just about completing a mission. It was about embodying everything they had learned, everything Mr. Miller had taught them. As they neared their target, they encountered heavy resistance. Enemy aircraft appeared out of nowhere, and the battle quickly escalated into an intense dogfight. The sky was filled with the sound of roaring engines and weapons fire. But in the chaos, the pilots never lost their focus. They moved as one, pushing their jets to the limit, evading fire and striking with deadly precision. In the heat of battle, one of the pilots found himself caught in a difficult situation. His controls were malfunctioning, and his jet was losing power. He tried to regain control, but the aircraft was unresponsive. Panic began to rise within him. He had been through enough to know what was at stake, and the pressure of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. But then, through the static of his radio, a voice came through. "This is Dragon 6. Stay calm. You know what to do. Just trust your training." The words were like a lifeline, grounding him in the chaos. His hands steadied, and he focused on the steps he had learned, remembering the lessons from Mr. Miller. Slowly, he regained control of his jet. His heart was still pounding, but his mind was clear. He had done it. They had done it. The mission continued, and despite the danger, the pilots completed their objective. They returned to base with a sense of quiet pride, knowing that they had succeeded not just because of their skill, but because of the strength of their bond, the leadership they had learned from Dragon 6, and their commitment to the greater good. As they debriefed, Colonel Hayes gave them a nod of approval. "You've done it again. You've shown what it means to trust each other and to lead with quiet strength. You're not just pilots, you're leaders now, and I couldn't be prouder of this team." As the pilots left the briefing room, they found themselves reflecting on the mission and the lessons they had learned. They had faced a formidable challenge, but they had overcome it together. They had embodied the legacy of Dragon 6, and they knew that as long as they continued to trust in each other, they could face whatever came next. The legacy of Mr. Miller was now a part of them, and they would carry it forward as they continued their service. They had learned the true meaning of leadership, not through accolades or medals, but through their actions, their loyalty, and their unwavering commitment to each other. The pilots had become a team, and that was something that no one could ever take away from them. They were no longer just soldiers. They were leaders, and they had learned from the best.